Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
Why does her peace become the one thing he can't stop thinking about after he finally gets the distance he said he wanted? Not because she became colder. Not because she played games. But because the version of her that stopped chasing quietly forced him to meet the version of himself he'd been running from. The strange part is, he might not even understand why it hurts. He'll tell himself she changed. That she's different now. That she's probably moved on. But deep down, what unsettles him isn't her absence. It's the silence where her constant reaching used to be. And once you've lived through that kind of silence, you realize peace can feel far more powerful than pursuit. There isn't always a final argument. I used to think every relationship that changed had to explode first. Someone slams a door. Someone says something cruel they can't take back. Someone cries. Someone blocks someone else. It feels dramatic enough that everyone knows the story has ended. But that's not what I've seen happen most often. Sometimes nothing happens. And somehow that's worse. Because one day she simply stops reaching. Not angrily. Not to prove a point. Not because she suddenly stopped loving him. She just gets tired. Not physically. Something quieter than that. The kind of tired that lives somewhere behind your ribs. The kind that comes after explaining yourself for the 15th time and realizing you're using different words to ask for the exact same thing. She doesn't announce it. She doesn't post quotes. She doesn't disappear to make him panic. She simply wakes up one morning and doesn't send the text she'd been rehearsing the night before. It's strange how invisible that moment is. Nobody watching from the outside notices. Her co-workers still hear her laugh. She still buys groceries. She still answers emails. She still waters the plants she almost forgot existed while she was spending so much emotional energy trying to keep one person emotionally close. Life looks exactly the same. Except, there's one less message sitting in his notifications. And somehow that tiny absence starts changing everything. Not immediately. That's the part people misunderstand. He doesn't instantly realize what happened. Actually, at first he almost enjoys it. He thinks, maybe this is healthier. Maybe we're finally giving each other space. Maybe things were getting too intense anyway. He tells himself he finally has room to breathe. And maybe part of him genuinely believes that. For a while, I've watched men do something interesting after they ask for space. Not all men, but enough that the pattern feels painfully familiar. They ask for less pressure, less expectation, less emotional conversation. Then they fill the silence with distractions so quickly they never actually experience the space they asked for. Work, the gym, video games, friends, scrolling until midnight, cleaning the garage that suddenly couldn't wait another day. Anything that lets the nervous system stay occupied. Because empty space has a habit of talking back. He doesn't miss her yet. Not exactly. He just notices something is different. His phone is quieter. Nobody asks how his meeting went. Nobody remembers he mentioned his mother's doctor's appointment 3 weeks ago. Nobody sends him the picture of a dog because it looks exactly like the one he pointed at during that random Sunday walk. It's all tiny. Almost embarrassingly small. Things a person would never think to grieve. Until they're gone. I remember hearing someone describe it once. He said, I didn't miss the conversations. He stopped for a second. Then corrected himself. No. I missed knowing someone would eventually start one. That sentence stayed with me longer than I expected. Because there's a difference. A painful one. At first he assumes she'll text eventually. She always has before. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe after work. Maybe over the weekend. She's probably just giving it a day. So he keeps living exactly the same way. He leaves his phone face down while making dinner. Checks it anyway. Nothing. He laughs at something on television. Then, without thinking, reaches for his phone. Nothing. He gets into bed. One last look before sleeping. Nothing. His body is checking before his mind has admitted it's waiting. The funny thing is, if you asked him whether he cared, he'd probably shrug. Nah. We're just giving each other space. And maybe he even believes himself while saying it. Human beings are remarkably good at explaining feelings they haven't actually felt yet. Meanwhile, she's doing something that looks incredibly ordinary. She's not trying to become mysterious. She's not studying dating advice. She's not timing responses. She's simply redirecting energy that had nowhere left to land. She goes for longer walks. Not because walking heals heartbreak. Because she can't sit in the apartment another night staring at the same wall. She reorganizes one kitchen drawer. Not because organization changes anything. Because doing something with her hands feels easier than texting someone who's already emotionally halfway out the door. She starts making coffee without immediately checking whether he's replied. The first morning she forgets to check. She almost feels guilty. Like she's betraying the version of herself that waited so faithfully. People call this moving on. Sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it's just exhaustion learning how to breathe. There's something quietly heartbreaking about watching hope lose its routine. Not disappear. Just stop showing up every morning. He doesn't know any of this. From his perspective, everything just became quieter. But quiet isn't empty. Quiet lets you hear things. And eventually, he starts hearing himself. That's where things become uncomfortable. One evening he's driving home. Nothing dramatic happened that day. Traffic was annoying. The coffee was terrible. Someone at work kept scheduling meetings that could have been emails. It's an ordinary Tuesday. A song comes on. Not their song. That's almost worse. Just one she happened to hum absent-mindedly months ago while looking out the passenger window. He reaches to skip it. Stops. Lets it play. By the time he gets home, he can't even remember what the song sounded like. He only remembers her humming. Memory works like that sometimes. It saves strange details. He walks into his apartment. Drops the keys into the bowl near the door. The sound echoes longer than it should. Maybe the apartment isn't actually quieter. Maybe he's finally noticing how quiet it always was. He opens the refrigerator. Nothing looks good. He isn't hungry. He eats anyway. Halfway through dinner, he unlocks his phone. Opens her profile. Doesn't like anything. Doesn't send anything. Just looks. As if seeing evidence that she's still existing somehow answers a question he hasn't admitted asking. Then he locks the phone. A minute later. Opens it again. No. I'm not going to text. Why? Because she wanted space too. Did she? Silence. I don't know. That little conversation never leaves the room. Nobody hears it. But it happens. More often than he'd ever admit. The hardest part isn't losing someone. It's realizing they stopped arranging their day around you. That realization arrives slowly. It isn't one giant heartbreak. It's 100 tiny collisions. She doesn't send the funny video anymore. She doesn't ask if he got home safely. She doesn't remind him to drink water during stressful weeks. She doesn't accidentally call while walking through the grocery store because she forgot whether he liked crunchy peanut butter or smooth. Those moments sounded ordinary while they were happening. Only later do they become sacred. There's another thing people rarely talk about. When someone has spent months or years pursuing you emotionally, you quietly begin assuming they'll always be there. Not because you're cruel. Because consistency becomes invisible. The sun rises every morning. You stop noticing it. Until one morning. It doesn't. He isn't devastated yet. That's important. People imagine regret arrives all at once. It usually doesn't. First comes confusion, then curiosity, then a strange irritation he can't explain. Why hasn't she reached out? Is she busy? Did she finally get tired? Did something happen? Should I ask? No. If she wanted to talk, she'd text. Right. Right. Meanwhile, she isn't thinking about strategy. She's learning what to do with evenings that no longer revolve around hoping he'll choose her. Some nights she still cries. Some nights she doesn't. Some nights she laughs at something completely unrelated and immediately feels guilty for laughing. Healing isn't clean. Neither is letting go. She still misses him. She just doesn't chase him anymore. Those are two very different things. And that's the moment everything quietly changes. Not because she became colder. Not because she stopped caring. But because her love stopped running after someone who kept walking away. The pursuit ended. The care didn't. At least not yet. But something inside her finally whispered. If he wants to know where I am emotionally, he can walk toward me too. She didn't say it out loud. She barely admitted it to herself. Yet somehow, that unspoken decision carried more weight than every conversation she'd tried to have before. Because for the first time, the silence wasn't asking him to come back. It was simply making room for whatever truth arrived next. And he still hadn't realized that the thing he thought he wanted, space, was about to become the loudest thing he'd ever heard. For a while, he mistakes relief for certainty. There's a difference. I didn't know that until I watched it happen. Or maybe, until I watched myself do it. Because sometimes when someone finally stops asking for more from you, your body relaxes before your heart catches up. The pressure disappears. No difficult conversations waiting after work. No long paragraphs asking, "Can we talk?" No feeling that someone is standing at the edge of your emotional door, hoping you'll finally let them in. At first, it feels lighter. He sleeps a little easier. Or at least he thinks he does. He tells himself, "This is what I needed. Things were becoming too much. I'm finally getting my life back." It's amazing how convincing those sentences can sound when you repeat them often enough. The strange part is, none of them explain why he keeps checking a phone that hasn't buzzed. Space is funny. People imagine space feels like standing on top of a mountain. Wide. Peaceful. Refreshing. Sometimes, space feels more like walking into an empty apartment after everyone has gone home. You wanted quiet. Then suddenly every sound feels louder. The refrigerator hum. The floorboards. Your own footsteps. Your own breathing. Your own thoughts. Especially your thoughts. He starts noticing something embarrassing. The first thing he reaches for during small moments isn't freedom. It's familiarity. He finishes a meeting. Without thinking, he reaches for his phone. There used to be a message. How did it go? Now. Nothing. He laughs at something his coworker says. For half a second he thinks, she'd think that's funny. Then remembers he has nowhere to send it. The thought dies before it reaches his hands. It's such a tiny disappointment. Barely worth mentioning. And yet, those tiny disappointments start stacking on top of each other. He doesn't call it loneliness. Not yet. Loneliness feels too dramatic. Too honest. Instead he says things like, "I've just been busy. I've had a lot on my mind. I'm tired." Maybe he is tired. But not from work. From carrying around feelings that refuse to introduce themselves. There was one memory someone shared that I haven't forgotten. He said the hardest part wasn't missing her. It was reaching the end of every day and realizing there was nobody who already knew how his day had gone. He had to start every conversation from the beginning again. Explain the context. Explain the people. Explain why something mattered. She already knew. She had been quietly collecting pieces of his ordinary life. He didn't notice while she was doing it. He noticed after she stopped. Distance has an odd way of revealing invisible labor. The emotional labor. The remembering. The noticing. The checking in. The tiny invisible threads that make someone feel accompanied. Those things rarely announce themselves while they're happening. They become obvious only after they disappear. He still tells himself she's probably fine. Actually, he hopes she's fine. No, that's not completely true. Part of him hopes she's doing okay. Another part, the part he'd never admit, hopes she misses him just enough to reach out first. It's ugly, but it's human. People don't always want someone back. Sometimes they just want proof they were still being chosen. Late one Thursday night. He's lying in bed scrolling through videos he isn't really watching. One ends. Another starts. Another. Another. He couldn't tell you what any of them were about. He's killing time. Or maybe trying not to feel it. His thumb pauses. He opens her profile. Again. Not because he's planning to message. Just to check. She's smiling in a photo with friends. Someone commented. She replied. He stares at the picture longer than necessary. She looks normal. That bothers him. Not because he wants her miserable. At least he doesn't think he does. But because some childish part of him expected to see evidence that she was struggling too. Instead, she looks like someone who kept living. He closes the app. Throws the phone onto the bed beside him. Rolls over. 5 minutes later. He picks it back up. What's wrong with you? Nothing. Then why are you checking? That I don't know. You do. No. I just. Silence. I thought she'd need me longer. That thought lands harder than he expected. Sometimes the hardest truths don't sound profound. They sound embarrassing. He starts staying out later. Not because he's having the time of his life. Because going home feels strangely unfinished. He'll sit in a parking lot after work for 10 extra minutes. Listening to music. Watching people carry groceries. Watching strangers hug goodbye. Not thinking about anything specific. Not allowing himself to think about anything specific. It's easier to sit in transition than to arrive somewhere empty. One Saturday morning he wakes up with absolutely nothing planned. Months ago, that would have meant brunch together. Or wandering through bookstores. Or arguing over where to eat. Or spending 40 minutes in a grocery store, because somehow buying cereal together turned into a full conversation about childhood memories. Now, he makes coffee. Drinks half of it. The apartment is clean. Laundry is done. There are no errands. No plans. Just time. He thought this was what he wanted. So why does it suddenly feel so heavy? He turns on the television. Doesn't watch it. Starts cleaning the kitchen that was already clean. Moves books from one shelf to another. Folds towels. Refolds them. Finds an old receipt in a jacket pocket. Throws it away. Stands there. For no reason. Just standing. Sometimes grief doesn't cry. Sometimes it alphabetizes your bookshelf. Meanwhile, she's changing too. Not in the dramatic movie version. She still has difficult mornings. Sometimes she wakes up reaching for her phone before remembering there's nobody to text. Sometimes she catches herself composing messages in her head. You'd laugh at what happened today. Then stops. Deletes the thought before it becomes a habit. She misses him. But she's also becoming someone who doesn't organize every emotion around whether he'll respond. That process is messy. Some days she feels strong. Other days she nearly sends the message anyway. Then she closes the phone. Not because she doesn't care. Because she's tired of asking someone to meet her halfway. People often think peace arrives as confidence. It rarely does. Sometimes peace begins as surrender. Not surrendering love. Surrendering the constant attempt to make another person love the same way you do. There's a quiet difference. He starts remembering conversations differently now. Not the arguments. Those were easy to dismiss before. It's the small conversations that return. Her laughing because he pronounced a word wrong. The way she'd always steal fries even after insisting she wasn't hungry. The habit she had of putting cold feet against his legs in bed because she knew he'd complain. At the time, those things barely registered. Now they replay without permission. Memory edits people strangely. It removes the noise. Leaves the warmth. He catches himself smiling at one memory. Then immediately feels annoyed. Seriously? It's been weeks. So move on. I am. Are you? I don't know. He begins telling friends he's enjoying being single. Maybe he believes it. Sometimes. Other times he hears himself talking and wonders who exactly he's trying to convince. One friend says, "You seem quieter lately." He laughs. "I'm just getting older." It's a good answer. Comfortable. No further questions. Certainly easier than saying, "I think I finally have enough silence to hear everything I was avoiding." Distance has another strange effect. It removes urgency. Without urgency, clarity slowly walks into the room. Not dramatically. Quietly. Almost unnoticed. He begins replaying moments that made no sense before. The night she went unusually quiet after dinner. He assumed she was tired. Maybe she was. Or maybe she'd simply run out of ways to explain herself. The morning she said, "I don't need you to fix it. I just need you to stay in the conversation." He remembers nodding. Then changing the subject. At the time it felt harmless. Now, that sentence keeps returning. Almost like unfinished business. He realizes something uncomfortable. She wasn't asking for perfection. She was asking for presence. Those aren't the same thing. He confused them. Maybe because presence felt harder. It required him to stay emotionally visible. Perfection was impossible. Presence was a choice. The irony is almost painful. He asked for distance because closeness felt overwhelming. Now distance has become the overwhelming thing. Not all at once. Not in some cinematic collapse. Just a slow accumulation of ordinary evenings. Ordinary mornings. Ordinary moments with nobody already waiting inside them. One night he's driving with the windows down. The city is quiet. Streetlights slide across the windshield. He reaches a red light and catches himself thinking, "I should tell her about." He stops. There's nobody to tell. The light turns green. The conversation never happens. Some losses don't look like breakups. They look like stories with nowhere left to go. That's when the freedom he wanted begins changing shape. It no longer feels like possibility. It starts feeling like responsibility. Because without her constant pursuit, there's nobody left to blame for the distance. No emotional conversations to avoid. No pressure to escape. No one pulling. No one chasing. Only one uncomfortable question sitting beside him in the silence. If nobody is pushing me away, why am I still standing here alone? And for the first time, he doesn't answer it. Because somewhere underneath all the explanations, he's beginning to suspect that the space he fought so hard to protect was never the thing he truly wanted. He just didn't know what to do with closeness when it was finally offered. There was a version of her he kept expecting. Not consciously. If you had asked him, he probably would have denied it. He would have said, "I'm not expecting anything. She's free to do whatever she wants. I've accepted it." But people don't always recognize the stories they're secretly waiting to see. Sometimes they only realize they were expecting something. When it never happens. He thought she'd come back one more time. Not forever. Just once. One late-night text. One emotional paragraph. One, "Can we please talk?" One small opening that would let him postpone making a real decision. Because that's what pursuit had quietly become. Time. Every time she reached toward him, he didn't have to move. He could think about it tomorrow. He could answer later. He could say he was overwhelmed. He could promise to have the conversation next weekend. There was always another chance. Until there wasn't. It's strange how quickly the mind creates routines. He became used to the rhythm. She would reach. He would hesitate. She would explain. He would withdraw. She would come back. Eventually. Always eventually. Until one day. Eventually never arrived. The first week, he barely noticed. The second week, he noticed but dismissed it. The third week, he started inventing explanations. She's busy. She's probably traveling. Maybe work is stressful. Maybe she's waiting for me to text first. That last thought lingered longer than he wanted it to. He immediately argued with himself. No. If she wants to talk, she'll talk. But another voice quietly answered. She always did. There are moments that don't look important while they're happening. Like standing in line for coffee. The person in front of him is deciding between oat milk and almond milk with the seriousness of someone negotiating world peace. Normally he would have smiled. Maybe even taken a picture to send her. This reminds me of you. Because she always took forever ordering coffee. Instead, he smiles to himself. Then immediately feels something sink inside his chest. Not heartbreak. More like a conversation that has nowhere to go. He orders. Walks outside. Sits in his car. The coffee suddenly tastes ordinary. Nobody tells you this. Missing someone isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's realizing your day keeps producing moments meant for someone who no longer occupies them. Meanwhile, she keeps living. Not perfectly. That's important. People romanticize peace as if it means never looking back. She still looks back. Sometimes she hears his favorite artist playing in a grocery store and has to stop herself from smiling. Sometimes she almost buys the snack he liked before remembering she's the only one eating dinner now. Sometimes she opens their old messages. Not because she wants to go backward. Because memory has strange habits. Then she closes them again. Not angrily. Just. Gently. Like putting an old photograph back into a drawer. He imagines something completely different. He imagines she's waiting. Not every minute. Just enough. Enough that if he finally reaches out, everything might still be suspended exactly where he left it. Human beings do this all the time. We freeze people in our memories, while they're busy becoming someone new. One Friday evening, he almost texts her. Not because he has some grand declaration. Actually, he has no idea what he'd even say. He types. Hey. Deletes it. Types again. Hope you've been okay. Deletes that too. Too formal. Too distant. Too late. He locks the phone. Puts it in his pocket. 10 minutes later. Takes it back out. Nothing has changed except his heartbeat. What are you afraid of? That she won't answer? No. Then what? Another pause. That she will. That answer surprises him. Because if she replies, everything becomes real again. He can no longer pretend this has simply been about needing space. He has to explain what he did with that space. And he isn't sure he has an answer. A lot of avoidance looks like confidence from the outside. It isn't. Sometimes it's just uncertainty wearing expensive clothes. A mutual friend mentions her name. Casually. No dramatic announcement. Just. Oh yeah, I saw her last weekend. His chest tightens before his face reacts. He hopes nobody noticed. So, how is she? He tries to sound uninterested. The kind of question someone asks out of politeness. Honestly, she seems lighter. Lighter. Of all the words. Not happier. Not dating someone. Not thriving. Just lighter. That word follows him home. What does lighter even mean? He starts filling in the blanks himself. Maybe she's sleeping better. Maybe she's laughing more. Maybe she's stopped rereading old conversations. Maybe she doesn't wonder every night whether she asked for too much. He doesn't know. But suddenly he wants to. The apartment feels different that night. Nothing has moved. Same couch. Same television. Same coffee mug sitting in the sink. But somehow, everything feels slightly unfamiliar. He walks from one room to another. Opens the refrigerator. Closes it. Looks out the window. Checks the weather even though he's not going outside. His body is restless. His mind keeps pretending it isn't. There is something deeply unsettling about realizing someone continued healing without your participation. Not because you wanted them to suffer. Because part of you quietly believed you would always matter in the process. Then one day, you realize they learned how to carry themselves. Without asking you to help. She isn't trying to teach him a lesson. That's what people often get wrong. Peace isn't always strategic. Sometimes it's survival. There comes a point where constantly reaching for someone who keeps pulling away begins changing the person you see in the mirror. She didn't stop because she stopped loving. She stopped because she no longer recognized herself while chasing. That's different. Very different. He starts remembering one conversation. She had laughed. Not a happy laugh. One of those exhausted laughs people make when they're trying not to cry. She said, "I feel like I'm always walking toward you." He answered too quickly. "I'm here." Looking back, he realizes what she meant wasn't physical. She wasn't talking about location. She was talking about effort. At the time, he completely missed it. Memory is cruel like that. It doesn't replay what happened. It replays what you failed to understand. Saturday afternoon. He's folding laundry. One of his sweaters still smells faintly like her shampoo. Or maybe it doesn't. Maybe memory creates sense too. He lifts the sleeve toward his face. Stops halfway. Feels ridiculous. Then smells it anyway. Nothing. Just detergent. He laughs at himself. Not because it's funny. Because embarrassment is easier than grief. There are behaviors people never confess. Opening old photos just to prove they still exist. Scrolling to the exact date of one trip. Watching a video with the sound off. Reading the same conversation, but stopping before the ending. Not because the ending hurts. Because the beginning reminds you of who you both used to be. He keeps expecting some sign. A birthday message. A random excuse. A question only she would ask. Instead, months begin teaching him something he never wanted to learn. Silence can become permanent without ever becoming hostile. No fight. No blocking. No revenge. Just two lives slowly building habits that no longer include each other. That realization doesn't arrive dramatically. It slips into ordinary moments. He changes his bedsheets. She doesn't cross his mind for almost an hour. Then suddenly, that realization hurts more than thinking about her. Because forgetting her for an hour feels like betrayal. Remembering her feels like loss. He can't decide which feeling is worse. You wanted space. I know. You have it. I know. So why aren't you happy? I thought I would be. What changed? I don't think the space changed. I think I finally got quiet enough to hear what I was actually missing. Meanwhile, she has difficult days too. She still reaches for her phone sometimes after something funny happens. Still catches herself thinking, I should tell him. Then she smiles sadly. Not because she's pretending she's over it. because she's learning that not every impulse has to become an action. She lets the moment pass. It hurts. Then it hurts a little less. Then another day passes. Then another. Healing isn't forgetting. It's needing less from the memory. He expected her to return as the woman who kept asking for reassurance. Instead, she became the woman who started giving reassurance to herself. Not perfectly. Not every day. But enough. Enough that her life slowly stopped revolving around whether he chose her. That quiet shift is almost invisible from the outside. But inside, it's enormous. The irony is painful. When she was pursuing him, he kept wondering why she couldn't just relax. Now that she finally has, he can't stop wondering why she doesn't reach anymore. The behavior he once called too much becomes the very thing he finds himself waiting for. Not because he suddenly enjoys being pursued. Because he didn't realize how much of her heart had been quietly holding the relationship together. And perhaps that's the most uncomfortable realization of all. He wasn't waiting for another text. Not really. He was waiting for proof that she still saw him as the emotional center of her world. But while he was waiting, she had already begun rebuilding a world where she could breathe without asking permission. She still remembered him. She still carried pieces of what they had. But she no longer organized her mornings around hope. She no longer measured her worth by his emotional availability. And that's the version of her he never prepared for. Not a woman who became cold. Not a woman who became indifferent. But a woman who discovered that peace doesn't always arrive because someone comes back. Sometimes, it arrives because you finally stop standing at a door that never fully opened. The strange thing about pursuit is that it gives both people a role to play. She reaches. He hesitates. She explains. He withdraws. She waits. He asks for more time. The cycle keeps moving, even when nothing is actually changing. Movement can feel a lot like progress. But they are not the same thing. Sometimes two people spend months running in circles and convince themselves they're getting somewhere simply because neither of them has stopped. When she was chasing, he rarely had to ask himself difficult questions. Not because he was a bad person. Because urgency has a way of distracting us from honesty. There was always another conversation waiting. Another misunderstanding to sort through. Another emotional storm to survive. Another promise to make. Another apology. Another, we'll figure this out. The relationship stayed alive through constant motion. It didn't matter that most of the motion was circular. It was still motion. And motion is comforting. Especially when you're afraid of stillness. I've started believing something that nobody told me when I was younger. Sometimes people don't avoid commitment. They avoid clarity. Because clarity removes every place left to hide. As long as someone keeps reaching for you, you never have to discover what you would do if they stopped. He didn't realize how much emotional responsibility had quietly been carried for him. She remembered birthdays. She remembered conversations. She remembered what upset him after difficult meetings. She remembered the names of people he barely mentioned. She remembered which coffee order meant he was stressed. She remembered when silence meant he wanted company. And when silence meant he wanted to be left alone. None of those things felt extraordinary. They simply became part of the background. Like electricity. You don't spend your day appreciating it. Until the lights go out. One afternoon. He's cleaning out old emails. Nothing sentimental. Just deleting junk mail. Coupons. Shipping confirmations. Random newsletters. Then an old calendar reminder pops up. Dinner with her 7:30. 2 years ago. He almost deletes it automatically. Instead, he just stares. He remembers the restaurant. She had been excited. He had spent most of dinner answering work messages. She hadn't complained. Not once. Looking back, that bothers him more than if she had. There were so many moments he mistook patience for permanence. That's the dangerous thing about patient people. They don't always tell you when they're reaching their limit. From the outside, they still look loving, still kind, still hopeful. Meanwhile, inside, they're quietly running out of places to keep disappointment. People often imagine emotional pursuit as dramatic. Crying, begging, arguments. Sometimes it looks nothing like that. Sometimes pursuit sounds like, "Are you okay? You seem distant today. Can we spend some time together this weekend? Did I do something wrong? I miss you." Simple sentences. Repeated enough times. They become exhausting for both people. Not because the questions are unreasonable. Because eventually they stop receiving honest answers. He always thought she wanted too much conversation. Now, he realizes she was asking the same question in 20 different ways. Are we still building this together? She never actually used those words. But that's what every conversation had been translating into. And every time he postponed answering, she heard something he never intended to say. One evening, he's sitting outside after work. The parking lot is almost empty. The air smells like rain. People walk past carrying backpacks and grocery bags. Everyone seems to know where they're going. He stays in the driver's seat. Engine off. Radio off. No reason to hurry home. He starts thinking about all the times she'd asked, "What are you thinking?" He used to hate that question. Not because it was invasive. Because he genuinely didn't know. Or maybe he knew and couldn't explain it. So he answered with the safest sentence available. Nothing. Nothing. Such a small word. People hide entire emotional lives inside it. The truth was, he was thinking about work. About whether he was enough. About disappointing his father. About money. About feeling responsible for everyone. About feeling emotionally clumsy. About how every vulnerable conversation made him feel like he was about to fail a test he never studied for. But saying all of that felt impossible. So he said, "Nothing." She accepted the answer. Until she couldn't anymore. The hardest conversations in relationships are rarely about the topic itself. They're about what the topic represents. When she asked, "Can we spend more time together?" he heard, "You're failing." When she said, "I need reassurance," he heard, "You're not enough." When she asked, "Can you stay with me while I'm upset?" he heard, "Fix everything." But that wasn't what she meant. Not even close. She wasn't asking him to become someone else. She was asking him to stay emotionally present. He kept translating presence into performance. No wonder he felt overwhelmed. There's something our nervous systems do when we feel inadequate. We create distance. Not because we don't care. Because distance temporarily reduces shame. For a few hours. Or a few days. Distance feels like relief. Until eventually, distance becomes loneliness wearing the mask of independence. She didn't understand this at the time either. She assumed his withdrawal meant indifference. Sometimes, it did. Other times, it meant panic. Those two emotions can look almost identical from the outside. One person walks away because they don't care. Another walks away because caring feels terrifying. The behavior is the same. The experience inside the body is completely different. One memory keeps returning. She had been crying. Not loudly. Just quietly. Looking down at the floor. She said, "I don't need perfect words. I just don't want to feel alone while I'm hurting." He remembers sitting there. Searching desperately for the correct thing to say. Finding nothing. So, he changed the subject. At the time, he thought he was preventing the conversation from getting worse. Looking back, he realizes he accidentally confirmed her deepest fear. Not because he meant to, Because silence communicates too. There is a version of emotional avoidance that looks incredibly polite. You don't yell. You don't insult. You don't leave dramatically. You simply never fully arrive. You answer, but not deeply. You listen, but only long enough. You apologize, without changing. You stay, without becoming emotionally available. From the outside, it almost looks healthy, until years pass, and one person feels desperately alone beside someone who never technically left. Now, with her pursuit gone, there are no more conversations interrupting his routine. No emotional check-ins. No difficult evenings. No uncomfortable questions. He finally has exactly what he thought he wanted. So why does peace suddenly feel so loud? Because without someone chasing him, he has nowhere left to place the responsibility. He can't say, "She's asking too much." She isn't asking. He can't say, "We'll talk later." Nobody's waiting. He can't complain about emotional pressure. The pressure disappeared. What's left is himself. That realization doesn't happen in one dramatic breakthrough. It happens while washing dishes, while driving, while standing in the shower, while lying awake at 2 a.m. staring at the ceiling. Ordinary places. Ordinary moments. The mind finally has enough silence to wander toward truths it spent years avoiding. He starts noticing something uncomfortable. Every time she asked for closeness, he experienced it as losing freedom. Now that she's gone, he discovers freedom without connection feels strangely empty. Maybe freedom wasn't what he wanted after all. Maybe he simply wanted closeness that didn't require him to confront the parts of himself he hadn't yet learned to understand. She, meanwhile, is learning something entirely different. For the first time in years, she isn't waking up wondering what mood he'll be in. She isn't rewriting messages before sending them. She isn't calculating whether now is the right moment to bring something up. She isn't monitoring every tiny emotional shift inside the relationship. Her nervous system is slowly leaving survival mode. Not overnight. Healing never works like that. Some mornings she still feels anxious for no reason. Some afternoons she catches herself expecting disappointment. Then she realizes nothing bad happened. The feelings simply belong to an older version of her life. It's strange how peace enters the body. Not with fireworks. With ordinary moments. Making breakfast without checking the phone. Watching a movie without wondering whether he's replying. Falling asleep before midnight because there's no unresolved conversation replaying in her head. Laughing with friends without secretly carrying emotional exhaustion into every room. Those moments seem insignificant. Until you remember how impossible they once felt. He expected her silence to create a vacuum. Instead, it created stability. Not because she stopped missing him. Because she stopped organizing her emotional world around his uncertainty. That difference changes everything. One Sunday afternoon, he finds an old notebook while cleaning. Inside, there's a grocery list she'd written. Milk. Pasta. Lemons. Coffee. At the bottom, in smaller handwriting, don't forget to buy his favorite cookies. He stares at those words for a long time. Not because of the cookies. Because of what they reveal. She had been thinking about him in moments when he wasn't even present. Quietly. Constantly. Without announcing it. He tries to remember the last time he made that kind of space for her. Nothing comes immediately. And somehow, that silence hurts more than any argument they ever had. Maybe that's why pursuit had always felt easier. As long as she kept reaching. He could believe the relationship was simply complicated. As long as she kept trying. He could postpone asking whether he was truly showing up. Her effort gave him more time. Her patience softened every consequence. Her hope delayed every ending. But peace changed the rules. Peace stopped negotiating. Peace stopped filling the silence for him. Peace quietly placed him alone in a room with every conversation he had postponed, every feeling he had avoided, every version of himself he had kept hidden behind the excuse of needing more space. And for the first time, he begins to understand something he never saw while she was still chasing him. Her pursuit had never been the thing trapping him. It had been protecting him. Because as long as she kept running toward him, he never had to discover whether he was willing to take even one honest step toward her. For the longest time, he thought another man would be the thing he'd have to compete against. Someone more attractive, more successful, more emotionally available. Someone who said all the right things. Someone who knew exactly how to love her. If she ever moved on, he imagined losing her to another person. That story made sense. It was familiar. It gave his mind something concrete to picture. What he never imagined was losing her to peace. Peace doesn't announce itself. It doesn't post photographs trying to make anyone jealous. It doesn't send cryptic messages. It doesn't demand attention. Peace simply begins replacing chaos one ordinary day at a time. And because it happens so quietly, most people don't notice it until it's already become someone's new normal. He still checks her profile sometimes. Not every day anymore. Maybe every couple of weeks. Maybe once a month. The gap between checking keeps growing. But whenever he does, he notices something difficult to explain. She looks comfortable. Not performatively happy. Not trying to prove anything. Just comfortable inside her own life. She smiles differently. There's less urgency in her eyes. She isn't posting dramatic quotes. She isn't disappearing from the world. She simply looks like someone who finally has enough room to breathe. That image stays with him longer than he expects. There was a sentence I once heard that refused to leave me. The opposite of chaos isn't excitement. It's peace. At first, it sounded almost disappointing. Shouldn't healing feel bigger than that? Shouldn't it come with certainty? Fireworks. Some overwhelming moment where everything finally makes sense. Instead, it often arrives as something so ordinary you almost overlook it. Sleeping through the night. Eating dinner without replaying old conversations. Driving home without checking whether someone replied. Laughing without guilt. Existing without constantly preparing for disappointment. She doesn't wake up wondering if today is the day he'll finally understand. That thought no longer greets her every morning. And losing that thought creates space for hundreds of new ones. What book she wants to read. Whether she should take that weekend trip. Calling her sister. Trying a new cafe. Joining friends for dinner without secretly spending half the evening staring at her phone beneath the table. Her attention slowly returns to her own life. She doesn't notice it happening. No one ever does. Attention comes home quietly. Meanwhile, he notices something odd. He still has freedom. Nothing about his schedule has changed. Nobody asks where he's going. Nobody questions why he's working late. Nobody wants another difficult conversation. Everything he once believed would make him feel lighter is still there. Yet somehow, he feels heavier. Not every day. Just enough days that he can no longer dismiss it as coincidence. One Tuesday evening. He's grocery shopping after work. Nothing special. Milk. Eggs. Bread. Coffee. He passes the flower section. For some reason, he stops. He remembers she used to buy fresh flowers every couple of weeks. Not because there was an occasion, just because they made the apartment feel softer. He used to think it was unnecessary. A waste of money. Now, he stands there looking at white tulips. He can't explain why. He almost buys them, then laughs quietly to himself. What would he even do with flowers? He walks away. Halfway through the next aisle. He turns around and buys them anyway. The apartment looks different with flowers. Not happier. Just more alive. That surprises him. Because maybe she wasn't trying to decorate a room all those years. Maybe she'd been trying to create a feeling. A place where life slowed down enough to be noticed. He never understood that before. He always thought love lived inside grand gestures. Maybe it had been sitting in small rituals the entire time. People often underestimate rituals. Morning coffee together. Asking how the meeting went. Sending a picture of the sunset. Touching someone's shoulder while walking past them in the kitchen. None of those moments seem important individually. But relationships are rarely built through one extraordinary event. They're built through thousands of ordinary moments that quietly tell the nervous system, you're not carrying life alone. When those rituals disappear, the body notices before the mind does. He begins remembering things differently now. Not through the lens of blame, through the lens of absence. He remembers how she would instinctively hand him the bigger towel after laundry. How she'd refill the water pitcher without mentioning it. How she'd always make enough coffee for both of them, even if she woke up first. He never asked for those things. She never announced them. They simply existed. Like breathing. Invisible while they were happening. Unforgettable after they stopped. One night, he calls an old friend. The conversation lasts almost 2 hours. When he hangs up, he realizes something. For the first time in months, he actually told someone the truth. Not the polished version. Not the version that sounded emotionally independent. The real one. I think I kept confusing peace with distance. His friend stays quiet. Then says, there's a difference. I know. I just figured it out too late. Neither of them speaks for a while. Sometimes silence isn't awkward. Sometimes it's respectful. There is something profoundly humbling about realizing that another person's emotional stability was never guaranteed. She didn't know him endless patience. She didn't know him another explanation. She didn't know him unlimited opportunities to become ready. Readiness has an expiration date. Not because love disappears. Because people eventually have to protect the parts of themselves that love cannot repair. She isn't thinking about him every morning anymore. That fact would have devastated her months ago. Now, it simply feels natural. Sometimes entire afternoons pass before his name crosses her mind. Then she remembers him while hearing a familiar song. Or driving past a restaurant they loved. She smiles. Feels the ache. Keeps driving. Healing doesn't erase memories. It changes what memories ask from you. At one point, he honestly believed that if she truly loved him, she would always wait. Now he understands something painful. Waiting wasn't proof of love. Waiting was proof that she hadn't yet chosen herself. Once she did, the waiting naturally ended. Not because her feelings vanished. Because she finally understood that loving someone else shouldn't require abandoning herself. There's a quiet confidence that develops after surviving your own heartbreak. Not arrogance. Not emotional walls. Something gentler. You stop panicking every time your phone stays silent. You stop interpreting uncertainty as something you must immediately solve. You stop chasing explanations that another person refuses to give. Life slowly teaches your body. You'll survive this too. That lesson cannot be borrowed. It has to be lived. Months later, they unexpectedly see each other. Not planned. No dramatic music. No impossible coincidence. Just a neighborhood bookstore. He notices her first. She's standing near the travel section, holding a book, completely absorbed in reading the back cover. For a moment, everything inside him freezes. Not because she's more beautiful than before. Although she is. It's something harder to describe. She looks settled. Like someone no longer fighting herself. She glances up. Their eyes meet. There's surprise. Then warmth. A small smile. The kind you give someone who mattered. Not someone you're trying to convince. They talk for a few minutes. Work. Family. The weather. Normal things. The conversation is kind. Comfortable. Almost. Too comfortable. He keeps waiting for the old emotional gravity to appear. It doesn't. She's fully present. But she isn't leaning toward him anymore. She isn't searching his face for hidden meaning. She isn't trying to repair anything. She simply enjoys the conversation. And then naturally lets it end. Well, I should get going. Yeah. It was good seeing you. You too. She smiles again. Then walks away. No hesitation. No looking back. Not because she doesn't care. Because she no longer needs the ending to be different from what it is. He watches her disappear between the shelves. And suddenly he understands something that had taken him months to learn. He hadn't lost her because another man said better words. He hadn't lost her because someone else was more impressive. He hadn't even lost her because she stopped loving him overnight. He lost the version of her that kept sacrificing her own peace in order to preserve the possibility of them. That version no longer exists. As he leaves the bookstore, he notices the strange calm inside himself. The sadness is still there. Regret hasn't disappeared. But for the first time, he stops wishing she had waited longer. Because now he finally sees what waiting had been costing her. Her sleep. Her confidence. Her ability to trust herself. Her sense of safety. No relationship is worth asking another human being to live that way forever. Perhaps that's the deepest misunderstanding about peace. People think peace is passive. It isn't. Peace is often the result of hundreds of painful decisions made when nobody is watching. The decision not to send one more message. The decision to stop rereading old conversations. The decision to let unanswered questions remain unanswered. The decision to build a life that no longer depends on someone else's emotional availability. Those choices rarely feel powerful in the moment. They usually feel heartbreaking. Until one ordinary morning, you realize you're breathing more easily than you have in years. And maybe that's why her peace became something he could never compete with. Not because peace made her stop loving. Not because peace erased their history. But because peace gave her something his uncertainty never could. A place where her nervous system no longer had to earn rest. A place where love no longer required constant negotiation. A place where silence wasn't filled with fear, but with space to hear herself again. In the end, he discovered that the strongest thing she ever did wasn't chasing him harder. It wasn't saying the perfect words. It wasn't finally walking away to prove a point. It was much quieter than that. She simply built a life where peace stopped feeling like something another person could give or take away. And once she found that kind of peace, it became the one thing no pursuit, no apology, and no delayed realization could ever replace. People often imagine that healing ends with indifference. As if one morning you wake up, and the person who once occupied every corner of your mind simply disappears. No ache. No memories. No hesitation. Just nothing. It sounds peaceful. But it isn't how most hearts actually work. Healing rarely asks you to stop loving. More often, it asks you to stop abandoning yourself in order to be loved. There is an enormous difference between those two things. For a long time, she believed love meant endurance. Staying a little longer. Explaining one more time. Being more patient. Choosing understanding over disappointment. Finding another way to reach someone who seemed emotionally miles away. She wasn't weak. She was hopeful. And hope can keep people standing in places that quietly wear them down. Not because they're foolish. Because love naturally wants to believe tomorrow will be different. There is something heartbreaking about watching your own standards slowly disappear. It never happens all at once. It happens one exception at a time. He's just stressed. This week has been difficult. Maybe I'm expecting too much. I know he loves me in his own way. None of those thoughts are unreasonable by themselves. The problem comes when they become permanent. When understanding someone else slowly replaces understanding yourself. She didn't wake up one day and decide to leave emotionally. She woke up one day and realized she no longer knew how to find herself inside the relationship. That realization frightened her. Not because she wanted to stop loving him, because she could no longer recognize the woman who kept accepting emotional uncertainty as the price of staying close. Sometimes, we think heartbreak begins when someone leaves. But heartbreak often begins much earlier. It begins the moment you notice you've started negotiating with your own needs. The moment your inner voice says, "Please don't ask for too much. Don't make this conversation difficult. Wait until he's in a better mood. Maybe tomorrow will be easier." Little by little, your emotional life becomes scheduled around someone else's availability. Eventually, you forget what your own emotional rhythm even feels like. He didn't see any of this while it was happening. Not because he lacked intelligence. Because emotional labor is invisible to the person who isn't carrying most of it. You don't notice someone constantly regulating the atmosphere. Until they stop. Then suddenly, the silence feels heavier than all the conversations you used to avoid. Months have passed now. His life continues. Work continues. Friends continue. Birthdays arrive. Seasons change. The world refuses to pause simply because one relationship ended. That surprises him. Grief always imagines time will stop. It never does. Life keeps asking ordinary things from broken hearts. Take out the trash. Answer emails. Pay the bills. Buy groceries. Smile politely at strangers. The ordinary keeps moving. Even while something inside you is learning a completely different language. One rainy evening, he finds himself driving without any destination. The windshield wipers move back and forth in steady rhythm. Traffic is slow. The city lights blur against the wet pavement. He remembers how she used to love drives like this. No music. Just conversation. Or sometimes, no conversation at all. Comfortable silence. At the time, he hardly noticed the difference between comfortable silence and emotional distance. Now, he understands they were never the same thing. Comfortable silence happens after connection. Emotional distance happens instead of connection. Back then, he confused one for the other. He parks near a river. Leaves the engine running. The rain continues tapping softly against the roof of the car. For the first time in a long while, he allows himself to stop asking the question that has haunted him. Could I still get her back? Instead, another question quietly appears. Who was I becoming while I kept avoiding myself? The second question hurts more. Because it doesn't depend on her answer. Only his. Growth is strange that way. It stops asking, how do I make someone stay? And begins asking, why was I afraid to fully show up while they were here? Those are completely different lives. Meanwhile, she isn't counting the months anymore. Healing has quietly stopped being her full-time occupation. She still has difficult days. Certain songs still catch her off guard. Certain streets still hold memories. Certain dates still feel heavier than others. But memories no longer dictate the direction of her day. They simply visit. Stay for a while. Then leave. Like weather. One Saturday morning, she wakes up naturally before her alarm. Sunlight spills across the bedroom floor. She makes coffee. Opens the windows. Watering the plants has become part of her routine now. She smiles as she notices a small new leaf growing from one of them. Months ago, she probably would have taken a picture and sent it to him. Now, she simply enjoys the moment. It belongs entirely to her. And somehow, that feels beautiful. People often mistake independence for emotional isolation. They aren't the same thing. Isolation says, I don't need anyone. Healing says, I no longer need to abandon myself to keep someone. One closes the heart. The other protects it. She hasn't become colder. If anything, she has become softer. Just not toward behaviors that constantly ask her to shrink. She laughs more easily now. She listens more carefully. She loves her friends with greater presence. She calls her parents more often. She notices sunsets again. She buys flowers without wondering whether someone else will appreciate them. She has not become less loving. She has simply stopped directing all of her love toward a place where it could never fully settle. At almost the same time, he starts therapy. Not because someone forced him. Not because he hopes it will magically repair the past. Because he is exhausted. Exhausted from carrying emotions he never learned to name. During one session, the therapist asks a simple question. When someone needed you emotionally, what did you believe they were asking from you? He answers almost immediately. To fix everything. And if you couldn't? I felt like a failure. The therapist nods. What if they were only asking you to stay? He says nothing. Because nobody has ever suggested that possibility before. The room becomes very quiet. Not uncomfortable. Just honest. I don't think anyone ever taught me the difference. His own words surprise him. Not because they're dramatic. Because they're true. Some people grow up believing emotions are problems to solve. Others grow up learning emotions are experiences to share. Those two languages often fall in love with each other. And then spend years misunderstanding every conversation. He isn't suddenly transformed. Healing doesn't work that way. The next week he still catches himself withdrawing during difficult conversations at work. He still changes the subject when emotions become uncomfortable. He still feels the old instinct to disappear. But now, he notices it. Awareness arrives before change. Always. You cannot interrupt a pattern you cannot see. She also notices old habits appearing from time to time. Someone new asks to spend time with her. She almost says, whatever works for you. Then pauses. No. She smiles. I'm actually free Thursday evening. Such a tiny sentence. Yet months ago, it would have felt impossible. Because it assumes her preferences deserve equal space. Healing often hides inside sentences nobody else notices. There is no villain in this story. Only two nervous systems trying to protect themselves in completely opposite ways. She reached closer whenever she felt uncertainty. He moved farther away whenever he felt overwhelmed. The more she pursued connection, the more pressure he experienced. The more he created distance. The more abandoned she felt. Neither intended to hurt the other. But intentions cannot erase repeated emotional experiences. Eventually, love becomes buried beneath survival strategies. If they met for the first time today, would everything be different? Maybe. Maybe not. People love imagining alternate endings. But life doesn't allow us to become today's version of ourselves without yesterday's mistakes. The woman who now protects her peace had to lose herself before she understood why boundaries mattered. The man who is finally learning emotional presence had to experience silence before he understood what avoidance had cost him. Growth rarely comes cheaply. There is one final truth that slowly settles over both of them. Love alone was never the problem. Love had always been there. Hidden inside grocery lists. Inside shared coffee. Inside forgotten birthday reminders. Inside small acts of care. Inside worried text messages. Inside waiting. Inside missing. Inside regret. The problem was that love, by itself, could not heal patterns neither of them yet understood. Love is powerful. But awareness gives love direction. Without awareness, even sincere love keeps repeating the same painful dance. Perhaps that's why the quiet ending of their story is also a beginning. Not necessarily the beginning of another relationship together. Life doesn't promise that. Some doors close forever. Some people become teachers rather than lifelong partners. And there is dignity in accepting that truth. The real beginning is something less visible. A woman who finally trusts that peace is not loneliness. A man who finally understands that emotional presence is not the same as having perfect answers. Two people, walking in different directions, both carrying lessons that could never have been learned while they were still trying to hold on to who they used to be. Maybe that is the most mature form of love. Not the kind that insists every relationship must last forever, but the kind that changes the people who experienced it. The kind that teaches one person to stop chasing what continually asks them to disappear. The kind that teaches another that intimacy is not created by eventually finding the perfect words, but by staying present when no perfect words exist. And perhaps that is why her peace became more powerful than her pursuit. Because pursuit had always been directed toward someone else. Peace finally turned her back toward herself. Once she found that place, love no longer felt like a question she needed another person to answer. It became something quieter, something steadier, something she carried within herself before she ever chose to share it with anyone again. And somewhere, in another part of the city, a man who once believed distance would protect him finally understands the lesson that arrived far too late. Not every love story ends with two people finding their way back to each other. Sometimes the ending is gentler than that. Sometimes love fulfills its deepest purpose not by keeping two hearts together, but by teaching each of them how to finally come home to themselves. There comes a moment after every ending, when the silence changes. At first, silence feels like waiting. You tell yourself they're just busy. Maybe they're thinking. Maybe they're giving each other space. Maybe tomorrow will be different. Silence still carries possibility. It still points toward the future. But eventually, almost without noticing, the silence becomes something else. It stops asking for an answer. It becomes acceptance. Not because every question has been resolved. Because the heart finally realizes that some questions are not meant to be answered by another person. They are meant to be outgrown. He didn't recognize the difference immediately. For months, he interpreted her silence the same way he had interpreted all the other quiet moments between them. Temporary. He believed there would eventually be another conversation. Another opportunity. Another opening. Another chance to explain what he couldn't explain before. Life had always seemed to give them one more conversation. Why would this time be different? But life has a strange way of revealing finality. Not through dramatic endings. Through the absence of new beginnings. Weeks pass. Then months. No unexpected message. No emotional confession. No midnight phone call. No carefully written email. Nothing. The silence remains exactly where she left it. And because it never changes, he slowly begins to understand that it wasn't created to punish him. It was created to protect her. That realization arrives one ordinary afternoon. He's sitting alone in a cafe he has visited dozens of times. The barista recognizes him, asks if he wants his usual order. He nods. She places the coffee on the table with an easy smile. Have a good afternoon. Such a simple interaction. Yet it reminds him of something. She used to know his order before he said a word. Not because she memorized it. Because she paid attention. Back then, he accepted that kind of attention as something natural. Now, he understands it had always been a form of love. Love doesn't always speak loudly. Sometimes it simply remembers. He watches people walking outside the cafe window. A young couple laughing over something on a phone. An older man carrying flowers. A mother kneeling to tie her child's shoe. Tiny acts of presence. Tiny moments of care. The world has always been full of them. He simply hadn't been looking. It's remarkable how grief changes your eyesight. Before, he noticed achievements, schedules, deadlines, responsibilities. Now, he notices tenderness. The way someone waits before crossing the street so another person can catch up. The way a woman brushes rainwater off her husband's jacket. The way strangers instinctively hold doors open. Love exists in thousands of unnoticed gestures. Perhaps it always had. He remembers something she once told him. Not during an argument. Not during a dramatic conversation. They had been washing dishes after dinner. Water running. Soap bubbles everywhere. She laughed and said, "You know, people usually think love disappears all at once." Then she smiled. "I think it disappears in tiny moments when people stop noticing each other." At the time, he barely responded. He probably nodded. Changed the subject. Asked what movie they should watch. Now, years later, those words return with astonishing clarity. Not because memory improved. Because experience finally gave them meaning. Memory is unfair that way. It doesn't preserve everything equally. It saves what your future self will eventually need. Meanwhile, her life continues unfolding. Not perfectly. No one's does. She still has stressful days. Still forgets appointments. Still worries about work. Still has evenings where loneliness quietly visits. Healing never removes ordinary human emotions. It simply changes your relationship with them. Loneliness no longer sends her searching for someone unavailable. Stress no longer convinces her she must sacrifice herself to feel secure. Sadness no longer whispers that she isn't enough. The emotions still come. They just no longer make her betray herself. One evening, she receives a message from a friend. Nothing important. Just an invitation to dinner. Months earlier, she might have declined. She would have stayed home replaying old memories. Wondering whether he missed her. Checking her phone every few minutes without realizing she was doing it. Tonight, she smiles. Replies, "I'd love to." Then she gets ready without thinking about him once. Not intentionally. It simply doesn't occur to her. Healing has quietly rearranged where her attention lives. If someone had told her this would happen, she wouldn't have believed them. Not because she lacked faith. Because heartbreak distorts time. When you're inside it, one painful week feels permanent. One sleepless night feels endless. One unanswered message feels like proof that you'll never feel whole again. But hearts are living things. They adapt. They rebuild. Not because they forget. Because they continue living. He also changes. Though much more slowly than he expected. Growth after avoidance often moves quietly. There's no dramatic transformation. No inspirational speech. No single breakthrough. Instead, he catches himself doing small things differently. When a coworker asks how he's doing, he gives a real answer. When his brother calls, he doesn't rush the conversation. When his mother tells him she's worried about something, he resists the urge to immediately solve it. Instead, he listens. Really listens. It feels awkward. Almost unnatural. But afterward, he notices something surprising. Presence requires less energy than pretending to have all the answers. For years, he thought emotional closeness demanded constant performance. Now, he discovers it often asks for something much simpler. Attention, curiosity, patience, the willingness to remain in the room even when no solution exists. One afternoon, his therapist asks him another question. "What do you think she was trying to teach you?" He almost laughs. "She wasn't trying to teach me anything. Maybe not intentionally. But what did you learn?" He looks toward the window. Rain taps softly against the glass. "I learned." He stops. Starts again. I learned that people eventually stop asking for what they realize they're never going to receive. The therapist nods. And I thought silence meant someone had given up on me. What do you think now? He takes a long breath. I think sometimes silence means someone finally stopped giving up on themselves. The words surprise him. Not because they're clever. Because they feel painfully true. That understanding changes something inside him. Not enough to erase regret. Nothing can do that. But enough to soften it. Regret often comes from imagining someone left because they loved you too little. Reality is frequently more complicated. Sometimes people leave because they finally begin loving themselves enough. There is a difference. A profound one. She isn't proud that she walked away. People often imagine healing as triumphant. It wasn't. There were nights she cried into her pillow. Mornings she almost reached for her phone. Afternoons when she convinced herself one conversation could fix everything. Walking away was not an act of emotional strength every single day. Sometimes it was simply the only decision she could survive. Strength often looks very ordinary while you're living it. She remembers the last message she never sent. She had written it. Read it. Edited it. Read it again. Then, instead of pressing send, she closed the phone. Not because she suddenly stopped loving him. Because she finally asked herself a different question. If he replies exactly the way he always has, will I be okay? For the first time, the answer was no. She realized she wasn't looking for communication anymore. She was looking for relief. And another conversation couldn't give her that. Only distance could. So she deleted the message. Not dramatically. Quietly. Then she made tea. Opened a book. And allowed the evening to remain exactly as it was. That ordinary decision changed the direction of her entire life. People rarely understand the courage required to stop seeking closure from the person who keeps creating the wound. Closure sounds romantic. But sometimes, closure is simply refusing to reopen the same door one more time. Months later, their mutual friend mentions him in passing. Just casually. He seems different these days. She smiles. I'm glad. Nothing more. No hidden sadness. No desperate curiosity. No need for additional information. The conversation naturally moves on. She notices something as she walks home afterward. She truly hopes he's doing well. Not because she wants him back. Because resentment no longer lives where love once did. Healing had made room for compassion. Without requiring reunion. Perhaps that is the most misunderstood part of letting go. People assume letting go means becoming emotionally cold. It doesn't. Sometimes it makes you warmer. Because your heart is no longer occupied by constant survival. You have room again. Room for friendships. For family. For strangers. For yourself. One autumn evening, he passes the apartment building where they once lived. He doesn't stop. He doesn't stare. He simply slows the car for a moment. The windows are different now. Someone else lives there. Someone else waters plants by those windows. Someone else laughs in that kitchen. Life has continued. Not only for him. For every place they once shared. He smiles. A sad smile. But a peaceful one. Because he finally understands that memories are not meant to become permanent addresses. They're places you visit. Not places you keep living. As he drives away, he realizes something unexpected. For months, he believed the greatest loss of his life was losing her. Now, he sees something more honest. The greatest loss had happened much earlier. It happened every time he chose emotional distance over vulnerability. Every time fear spoke louder than love. Every time he assumed there would always be another opportunity to become present. That realization is painful. But it is also freeing. Because it means the future doesn't have to repeat the past. And somewhere else, without knowing any of this, She finishes another ordinary day. She locks her front door, waters the plants, answers a message from a friend, places a bookmark inside the novel she's reading, turns off the kitchen light, climbs into bed. There is no dramatic soundtrack, no perfect ending, no certainty about what love will look like years from now. Only one quiet truth. She no longer falls asleep wondering whether someone else's uncertainty defines her worth. That question no longer belongs to her life. Maybe that was what her silence had been saying all along. Not, I stopped loving you. Not, I wanted you to suffer. Not even, I hope you regret losing me. Her silence carried a quieter message. One she probably couldn't even put into words while she was living it. It simply said, I cannot keep disappearing inside this relationship. And once she finally listened to that truth, everything else slowly followed. The chasing ended. The waiting ended. The bargaining ended. Not because her heart became smaller, but because it finally became safe enough to stop surviving. Perhaps that is why her silence ultimately became more powerful than every conversation they ever had. Because words had spent years asking for change. Silence quietly became the change. It didn't force him to understand. It simply gave both of them the space to become people who finally could. And in the end, that was the one gift neither of them knew they had been searching for all along. Perhaps the greatest misunderstanding about love is that people believe it must constantly be pursued. We grow up surrounded by stories that celebrate chasing. Running after someone at the airport. Standing outside their house in the rain. Writing one final letter. Making one last grand confession. We are taught that persistence is romantic. That if love is real, you never stop trying. But life quietly teaches a different lesson. The healthiest love is rarely the one that requires endless pursuit. It is the one where two people keep choosing each other, without either person having to disappear to make it possible. She didn't stop chasing because she stopped believing in love. She stopped chasing because she finally understood what love wasn't supposed to feel like. Love wasn't supposed to feel like anxiety every morning. It wasn't supposed to feel like constantly measuring someone's mood before speaking. It wasn't supposed to feel like celebrating tiny pieces of affection while quietly starving for consistency. For a long time, she confused relief with happiness. If he replied after hours of silence, she felt relieved. If he finally opened up after weeks of emotional distance, she felt relieved. If one weekend went peacefully, she felt relieved. But relief is not the same as security. Relief only exists because fear existed first. Real love doesn't constantly ask the nervous system to recover. That realization came slowly. Not through books. Not through advice. Not through motivational speeches. It arrived through exhaustion. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from loving someone you are always trying to reach. It isn't physical. It settles somewhere much deeper. You wake up tired before the day even begins. You replay conversations while brushing your teeth. You rehearse future discussions while driving to work. You monitor every text message, every facial expression, every pause. Your body never truly rests. Because somewhere inside, it believes connection could disappear at any moment. Living like that changes a person. Not dramatically. Quietly. She remembered one Sunday afternoon. Nothing extraordinary happened. They had spent the day together. They watched a movie. Ordered takeout. Folded laundry. Everything looked perfectly normal. Yet while he sat scrolling through his phone, she caught herself studying his face. Not because she admired him. Because she was trying to predict whether something was wrong. Would tonight be another distant evening? Would tomorrow feel different? Should she ask? Should she wait? Should she pretend not to notice? By the time she realized what she was doing, she felt emotionally exhausted. Nothing had even happened. that frightened her more than any argument ever could. She realized her nervous system had become conditioned to anticipate emotional withdrawal, even during peaceful moments. Love should not require constant emotional surveillance. When it does, the relationship quietly becomes a place where the body cannot relax. Meanwhile, he had no idea this was happening. Not because he didn't care, because internal experiences are invisible. From his perspective, nothing was wrong. He wasn't angry. He wasn't planning to leave. He was simply quiet, simply tired, simply distracted. He assumed she knew that. What he didn't understand was that unpredictability feels very different to the person waiting beside it. When reassurance arrives inconsistently, the mind begins searching for danger everywhere. Months after they separated, he reads something that stops him. It isn't from a psychology textbook. It's just a simple sentence. Consistency creates safety. He reads it twice. Then again. For words. Yet they explain years of misunderstanding. He had always believed love was measured by intensity. She had been searching for consistency. He gave powerful moments. She needed dependable ones. Neither understood the other's language. There are relationships filled with passion, yet starving for stability. There are relationships filled with attraction, yet empty of emotional safety. People often mistake intensity for depth. But intensity can exist without intimacy. Arguments can be intense. Jealousy can be intense. Longing can be intense. Even uncertainty can feel incredibly intense. Depth is something quieter. Depth allows two nervous systems to stop preparing for disaster. One evening, he decides to cook dinner. Not because he enjoys cooking. Mostly because he's trying to spend less time distracting himself. The kitchen is quiet. Vegetables sit on the counter. A pot of water begins to boil. Without thinking, he reaches for 2 plates. Then stops. He stares at them for a moment. One plate goes back into the cupboard. Such a tiny moment. Yet grief often lives inside habits. Your hands remember before your mind does. He smiles to himself. Not because it no longer hurts. Because it hurts differently now. The sharpness has softened. What remains isn't panic. It's gratitude mixed with regret. He finally understands something beautiful she once created. Even if he understood it after it was gone. At the same time, her life has become wonderfully ordinary. She laughs at work. Forgets where she left her keys. Calls her father on Sunday afternoons. Complains about traffic. Starts reading a novel she ends up disliking halfway through. Life is no longer divided into days when he texts and days when he doesn't. Life has become larger than the relationship ever was. This is what healing quietly does. It restores proportion. Heartbreak convinces you one person is your entire emotional universe. Healing gently reminds you they were an important chapter, not the whole book. She no longer measures her worth by someone's emotional availability. That sentence sounds simple. Living it is not. Because many people spend years believing that being chosen determines their value. If someone stays, they feel lovable. If someone withdraws, they question themselves. Healing slowly untangles those two experiences. Someone else's capacity for intimacy is not evidence of your worth. It is evidence of theirs. One afternoon, she meets an elderly woman in a bookstore. The woman is searching for a poetry collection. They talk for only a few minutes. Before leaving, the older woman says something unexpected. The older I get, I don't think love is about finding someone who never changes. She smiles. I think it's finding someone who lets you feel like yourself while both of you change. The conversation lasts less than 5 minutes. Yet it stays with her for weeks. Because she realizes she had spent years becoming smaller inside love. Real love should make room for expansion. not disappearance. Expansion doesn't always look exciting. Sometimes it looks like speaking honestly. Sometimes it looks like resting. Sometimes it looks like saying, "No, that doesn't work for me," without apologizing. Sometimes it looks like laughing without checking whether someone else approves. Freedom often arrives disguised as ordinary moments. He begins noticing something similar. His therapist asks him to describe what emotional safety might feel like. He struggles, then says, I think it would feel like not worrying that one difficult conversation could end everything." The therapist smiles gently. "And could you offer that to someone?" He doesn't answer immediately, because he realizes he had never offered that certainty. Not intentionally, but unintentionally. His emotional withdrawal had always left the future feeling uncertain. No wonder she kept reaching for reassurance. Her body was trying to create stability where none existed. He doesn't hate himself for this realization. Growth rooted in shame rarely lasts. Instead, he becomes curious. Why had vulnerability always felt dangerous? Why had closeness made him anxious? Why had receiving love sometimes felt harder than giving it? Those questions begin opening doors he had spent years keeping locked. Healing isn't only learning new behaviors. Sometimes it's finally becoming curious about old ones. If they met today, they would probably recognize each other immediately. Not because of appearance, because of presence. She would notice he listens longer before speaking. He would notice she no longer apologizes for taking up emotional space. They are both different now. Not perfect, simply more aware. Perhaps awareness is one of the most loving qualities a person can develop, because awareness interrupts patterns before they become wounds. There is a quiet dignity in becoming someone your younger self needed. She becomes the woman who no longer abandons herself for love. He slowly becomes the man who no longer mistakes emotional distance for strength. Neither transformation happens overnight. Both require countless ordinary choices. Listening instead of defending. Resting instead of chasing. Speaking instead of withdrawing. Trusting instead of controlling. Tiny choices. Repeated over and over, until they slowly become character. People often ask what happened to the love, as though love simply vanished. Maybe it didn't. Maybe love remained exactly where it had always been. Hidden beneath fear. Hidden beneath childhood survival strategies. Hidden beneath unspoken expectations. Hidden beneath nervous systems trying desperately to stay safe. Love was never absent. Safety was. And without safety, love struggles to breathe. That may be the quiet truth hiding beneath so many relationships. Most people don't leave because they stop loving. They leave because they stop feeling emotionally safe enough to keep loving in the same way. There is only so long a heart can survive without rest. Eventually, it chooses peace. Not because peace is more exciting than love. Because peace allows love to exist without fear. Years from now, they may occasionally remember each other. A familiar song. A city street. A favorite restaurant. A rainy afternoon. The memories will still arrive. Some will bring smiles. Some will bring sadness. That is the nature of being human. But memories no longer ask either of them to return. They simply remind them of who they once were, and how far they have both traveled. Maybe that is why the kind of love that lasts the longest is never built on pursuit. It is built on presence, on consistency, on emotional honesty, on two people who keep choosing each other even after the excitement settles into ordinary life. Because ordinary life is where real love spends most of its time. Not inside dramatic reunions. Not inside impossible promises. But inside shared breakfasts. Quiet evenings. Gentle conversations. Unhurried apologies. Reliable kindness. The decision to remain emotionally present when life becomes complicated. In the end, she didn't discover that love was an illusion. She discovered something much more hopeful. She discovered that love never needed to be chased in the first place. The right kind of love doesn't ask one person to carry the entire emotional weight of the relationship. It doesn't reward endless waiting. It doesn't confuse uncertainty with passion. Instead, it quietly meets you where you are. Again, and again, and again, until one ordinary day, you realize that peace and love are no longer competing with each other. They have become the very same place. And perhaps that is the ending neither of them expected when the silence first began. Not a story about who won. Not a story about who came back. But a story about two people who, through loss, finally learned the difference between chasing love and becoming someone capable of receiving the kind of love that never needed chasing at all. One of life's quietest tragedies is that people sometimes become the person their partner always needed, only after the relationship has ended. Not because they didn't care before, not because the love wasn't real, but because growth often arrives through loss. Some lessons refuse to be learned while everything still feels available. Only when something is truly gone does the mind finally stop defending itself long enough to listen. For months, he believed his greatest mistake was not saying the right words. He replayed conversations, wondered what he should have texted, imagined different endings, different apologies, different timing. He searched for the sentence that could have changed everything. But eventually, he realized something uncomfortable. The relationship had never been waiting for better words. It had been waiting for a different version of him. That realization wasn't cruel. It was honest. Words had never really been the problem. She had heard beautiful promises before. She had believed hopeful explanations. She had accepted apologies. She had patiently listened to reasons. None of those things were meaningless. But eventually, she needed consistency more than reassurance. Because reassurance comforts fear. Consistency slowly removes the need for fear altogether. He thinks back to one particular evening. She had asked him a question that seemed so ordinary at the time. "Can I ask you something?" He nodded. She hesitated before speaking. "When something is bothering you, why do you always disappear first?" He remembers feeling defensive almost immediately. "I don't disappear. I just need space." At the time, he genuinely believed those two things meant the same. Now he understands they didn't. Space is something both people understand together. Disappearing is something only one person chooses. Space says, "I'll come back." Disappearing leaves the other person wondering if you'll come back at all. That uncertainty had quietly shaped their entire relationship. He wishes he had understood that then. Not because it would have guaranteed a different ending, but because it would have allowed her nervous system to rest. Looking back, he realizes she wasn't asking him to become someone else. She was asking him to stay emotionally present long enough for trust to grow. Trust is an interesting thing. People often think trust is built through extraordinary acts. Grands sacrifices. Life-changing moments. Dramatic declarations. In reality, trust is built in very ordinary places. Answering when you say you'll call. Following through on small promises. Being emotionally available after difficult conversations instead of disappearing. Looking at someone while they speak. Remembering what matters to them. Showing up. Again. And again. Until predictability becomes love's quiet language. She had been speaking that language all along. He simply wasn't fluent yet. Meanwhile, she never imagined he would eventually understand. By the time she walked away, she had stopped expecting transformation. Not because she believed people couldn't change. Because she understood something important. Real change cannot happen because someone begs for it. It has to become personally meaningful. Otherwise, it lasts only until the next uncomfortable moment. That realization had been one of the hardest parts of letting go. She wasn't leaving because she thought he was incapable of growth. She was leaving because she could no longer build her future around potential. Potential is beautiful, but relationships are lived in reality. You don't wake up beside someone's future. You wake up beside who they consistently are today. She had loved his possibilities. She had imagined the man he could become. She had caught glimpses of him. Small moments. A vulnerable conversation. An unexpected apology. A weekend where he seemed completely present. Those moments weren't fake. They were real. They simply weren't sustainable yet. She kept falling in love with the glimpses, while quietly surviving the distance between them. Eventually, the distance became too large to ignore. There is a dangerous habit many loving people develop. They become emotionally committed to someone's potential instead of their patterns. Potential says they could become incredible. Patterns quietly answer. But who are they repeatedly choosing to be? Both matter. Only one creates daily life. Months later, he begins volunteering on Saturday mornings at a local community center. Not because he's trying to become impressive. Because his therapist suggested finding places where presence matters more than performance. The work is simple. Helping organize donations. Moving boxes. Talking with older volunteers. Listening to stories. One elderly man tells him about losing his wife years ago. "We argued plenty," the man laughs softly. "But I always knew she'd be there after we calmed down." The sentence lingers. I always knew she'd be there. He realizes. Certainty had been one of the greatest gifts in that marriage. Not perfection. Reliability. Driving home afterward. He wonders whether anyone had ever truly felt that certainty with him. The answer hurts. Not because he never loved deeply. Because he often disappeared whenever love became emotionally demanding. He wasn't absent physically. He was absent emotionally. There is a difference. Sometimes someone can sit beside you on the couch, while feeling thousands of miles away. She knew that feeling intimately. There had been evenings when they watched television together. Yet she felt completely alone. Not because he ignored her. Because she sensed he wasn't really there. His body remained. His attention drifted elsewhere. His emotions closed quietly behind invisible doors. She often wondered whether she had imagined it. She hadn't. The body notices emotional absence long before the mind finds words for it. Researchers often describe this as emotional attunement. But people don't experience it as theory. They experience it as a feeling. A room either feels emotionally safe, or it doesn't. You either feel received, or you feel managed, listened to, or tolerated, seen, or merely observed. Those differences shape relationships far more than dramatic conflicts ever do. One autumn afternoon, she sits alone on a park bench reading. Children are playing nearby. Dogs chase tennis balls across the grass. Wind moves gently through the trees. She closes her book for a moment and simply watches. Life feels wonderfully ordinary. Not exciting. Not dramatic. Just peaceful. Years ago, she would have mistaken this feeling for boredom. She had become so accustomed to emotional unpredictability that calm once felt unfamiliar. Now, calm feels like home. Her nervous system no longer mistakes peace for emptiness. That may be one of healing's greatest gifts. Sometimes people ask, how do you know you've healed? Not because you never think about them. Not because every memory disappears. But because your body no longer braces for pain every time their name crosses your mind. The memory remains. The emergency leaves. He experiences something similar. One evening, he comes across an old photograph while cleaning a drawer. They're both laughing. Neither is looking at the camera. For a moment, his chest tightens. Then something unexpected happens. He smiles. Not because he believes they'll reunite. Because he finally allows himself to appreciate what was beautiful. without immediately reaching for what can no longer be changed. Grief has matured into gratitude. Not complete gratitude. There is still sadness. But sadness no longer controls the entire memory. He quietly says aloud, "You really loved me." No one hears him. The apartment remains silent. For years, he focused on everything she wanted him to become. Now, he sees everything she had already been giving. Patience, curiosity, forgiveness, gentleness, countless second chances. She had loved him in ways he could only fully recognize after learning to love with greater awareness himself. That realization humbles him. There is no bitterness left in her either. Occasionally, someone asks what happened between them. She doesn't tell a dramatic story. She doesn't make him the villain. She simply says, "We loved each other. We just weren't ready in the same ways." People sometimes look disappointed by that answer. They expect betrayal, cruelty, someone to blame. But life isn't always divided into heroes and villains. Sometimes it's simply two people whose emotional timelines never quite matched. Perhaps that is one of adulthood's most painful truths. Timing is not everything. But timing matters. A person may sincerely become capable of healthy love, just not before someone else has exhausted their capacity to wait. Neither reality cancels the other. Both can be true. If they crossed paths years from now, she would probably notice the difference immediately. Not in his appearance. In his pace. He would no longer rush uncomfortable conversations. He would ask questions instead of assuming. He would remain present when emotions became complicated. She would recognize the man she once believed existed beneath all the fear. The version she hoped would eventually emerge. The version she loved long before he knew how to become him. And perhaps that would be enough. Not enough to begin again. Some stories aren't meant to restart. But enough to quietly smile. Enough to know that love had not been wasted. Because love that leads two people toward greater emotional maturity is never truly lost. Even if the relationship itself doesn't survive. There is something deeply beautiful about becoming someone another person once prayed you would become. Even if they are no longer there to witness it. Not because you hope they'll return. Because the transformation finally belongs to you. He no longer learns emotional presence to keep someone. He learns it because this is the kind of man he wants to be. She no longer protects her peace because she's afraid of heartbreak. She protects it because she has discovered it is where her truest self lives. Neither of them is growing for the relationship anymore. They are growing for the life that continues beyond it. Maybe that is why endings deserve more respect than they usually receive. We often measure relationships by whether they lasted. But perhaps another question matters just as much. Who did they help you become? Some relationships teach trust. Some teach courage. Some teach boundaries. Some teach forgiveness. Some teach you how to receive love. Others teach you why you must first stop abandoning yourself. This relationship taught both of them something neither could have learned alone. She learned that peace is not something another person gives you. It is something you stop giving away. He learned that love is not measured by what you feel in private. It is measured by how safe another person feels in your presence. In another life. Perhaps they would have met at exactly the right time. Perhaps they would have recognized these lessons before the pain. Perhaps they would have built the quiet life they once imagined. But life isn't built from perhaps. It is built from choices. From seasons. From growth that often arrives later than we wish. And so, the woman who stopped chasing continued walking toward a life that no longer required her to earn love. And somewhere else, the man she once waited for finally became the person she had always believed he could be. Not because she stayed long enough to change him, but because losing her forced him to meet the version of himself he had been avoiding all along. Perhaps that is the quiet irony at the heart of so many love stories. Sometimes, the person you become because of someone's love is the very person they never waited long enough to meet. Perhaps the greatest surprise of all is that healing was never meant to make him return. It was never a strategy, never a lesson, never a carefully planned way to make someone miss her. She did not become peaceful so he would notice. She became peaceful because she could no longer survive living at war with herself. That is the part so many people misunderstand. When someone finally chooses themselves, it is rarely an act of revenge. It is usually an act of rescue. In the beginning, she didn't feel rescued. She felt lost. The mornings were still quiet. The coffee still tasted different. She still reached for her phone before remembering there would be no message waiting. Healing did not arrive like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. It arrived almost invisibly, one ordinary decision at a time. She ate breakfast even when she wasn't hungry. She answered friends who had patiently continued inviting her out. She went for walks without listening to sad songs. She cleaned rooms she had neglected. She laughed unexpectedly during a movie and realized, halfway through the laugh, that she hadn't thought about him for nearly an hour. An hour. Months earlier. That would have felt impossible. Healing is rarely dramatic. It is built from hundreds of ordinary moments that almost seem too small to matter. Until one day, you look back and realize those tiny moments quietly built an entirely new life. He experienced something similar. Only his healing began from a different place. Not from learning to let go of someone else, but from learning to stop avoiding himself. For years, he had believed that staying busy meant moving forward. He filled his calendar, worked longer hours, accepted extra responsibilities, kept conversations light, stayed productive. From the outside, his life looked stable, successful even. But activity and emotional presence are not the same thing. You can spend years moving, without ever allowing yourself to truly arrive. One Saturday morning, he wakes earlier than usual. No alarm, just sunlight filtering through the curtains. He makes coffee, opens the window, listens to birds he never noticed before. The apartment is completely quiet. Months ago, this silence would have frightened him. He would have reached for his phone, turned on the television, looked for noise, anything to interrupt his own thoughts. Today, he simply sits, coffee warming his hands, watching sunlight slowly move across the wooden floor. For the first time in years, stillness no longer feels like emptiness. It feels like company, his own. Perhaps that is one of the final stages of healing, when your own presence becomes enough. Not because you stop loving other people, but because loneliness is no longer confused with abandonment. You discover that solitude and isolation are not the same experience. Isolation says, "No one is here." Solitude quietly answers, "I am." She discovers this too. One rainy afternoon, she cancels plans because she genuinely wants to stay home. Not because she's hiding from the world. Not because she's hoping he'll suddenly call. She simply wants a slow evening. She lights a candle, makes soup, wraps herself in a blanket, reads half a novel before falling asleep on the couch. Years ago, an evening alone would have felt like evidence that something was missing. Now, it feels complete. There is profound freedom in no longer needing your peace to be witnessed by someone else before believing it exists. People often ask, what happens after healing? As though healing is the destination. It isn't. Healing simply returns you to your own life. The life that had quietly been waiting while your attention was consumed by surviving. She begins making plans that have nothing to do with relationships. A weekend trip with friends. A photography class she had postponed for years. Learning to cook recipes her grandmother once made. Calling her mother more often. Planting herbs on the balcony. Small things. Beautifully ordinary things. None of them erase the past. But together, they create a future that no longer depends on revisiting it. Meanwhile, he notices something changing in the way he loves everyone around him. He listens more carefully. He interrupts less. When a friend shares something painful, he no longer rushes to solve it. He simply stays. There is courage in staying, far more than he ever understood before. He once believed strength meant having answers. Now, he thinks strength often means remaining emotionally available when there are none. His therapist says something during one of their final sessions. "You've spent months asking whether you lost the right person." He nods. The therapist smiles gently. "I think you've been asking the wrong question." Silence fills the room. The better question is, have you become someone who can fully receive the next healthy love that enters your life? He doesn't answer immediately, because he understands. That question is no longer about her. It is about him, about the life still waiting ahead. Growth quietly shifts our questions. At first, heartbreak asks, how do I get them back? Later, it asks, why did this happen? Eventually, if healing continues, the question changes once more. Who am I becoming because of this? That final question rarely has a dramatic answer. It unfolds slowly. Across months. Across years. Across countless ordinary choices. If someone met them separately now, they would never know the story that connected them. They would simply meet a woman who seems deeply at ease with herself. Someone who laughs freely. Who speaks honestly. Who no longer apologizes for needing reciprocity. Who has learned that boundaries are not walls. They are invitations for healthier love. They would also meet a man who listens before reacting. Who no longer mistakes silence for emotional control. Who understands that vulnerability is not weakness, but trust offered aloud. Who has learned that consistency is one of love's quietest forms. Neither person looks extraordinary, because healing rarely changes your appearance. It changes your presence. Presence cannot be performed. Children recognize it. Animals recognize it. Friends recognize it. It is the feeling of being fully met by another human being. Not managed. Not analyzed. Not fixed. Simply met. That is what both of them had been searching for all along. Not perfection. Presence. Sometimes, life gives us closure in unexpected ways. Not through one final conversation. Not through reunion. But through becoming someone who no longer requires the past to explain the present. Years later, he walks past a cafe they once visited together. Someone else occupies their favorite table. He smiles. Keeps walking. There is no ache demanding he stop. No desperate desire to rewrite history. Only gratitude. That place belonged to another version of himself. A younger man. A more frightened man. A man who loved sincerely, but did not yet understand how to remain emotionally present. He silently thanks that younger version for surviving long enough to learn. Then continues home. On another day, she hears their old favorite song while shopping for groceries. For a brief moment, everything slows. The melody carries memories effortlessly. Road trips. Late-night conversations. Shared laughter. The way he smiled without realizing it when he became genuinely happy. She smiles too. Not because she wants those days back. Because she can finally honor them without abandoning where she is now. Memory no longer asks her to return. It simply reminds her that love once existed. And that it helped shape who she became. Perhaps that is the most beautiful ending any relationship can offer. Not eternal togetherness. Not permanent separation. But transformation. Love changes us. Even when it doesn't stay. Especially when it doesn't stay. There is a misconception that letting go means deciding someone no longer matters. It doesn't. Some people matter forever. Their influence remains woven into your life. You quote things they once said without realizing it. You cook recipes they introduced you to. You visit places they loved. You become gentler because they once showed you kindness. Or stronger because they unknowingly taught you boundaries. The relationship may end. Its influence often doesn't. She never stopped appreciating what was beautiful. She simply stopped sacrificing herself to preserve what was hurting her. There is wisdom in knowing the difference. Love should expand your life, not slowly shrink it. Love should invite you home to yourself, not ask you to keep leaving pieces of yourself behind. That was the lesson she finally carried forward. He also carries something forward. Whenever someone important says, "Can we talk?" he no longer feels the instinct to retreat. He notices the old fear, breathes, and stays. Not perfectly. Sometimes his voice still shakes. Sometimes uncertainty still appears. Healing does not erase old patterns overnight. But awareness now arrives before avoidance. That changes everything. Because patterns lose much of their power once they are seen. People sometimes imagine happy endings as dramatic reunions. Two people running into each other's arms. Music swelling. Promises renewed. Life is usually quieter than that. Sometimes the happiest ending is two people who never reunite. Yet both continue becoming healthier because they once loved each other. That kind of ending receives very little attention. Yet it may be one of the most hopeful endings of all. And so, the woman who once exhausted herself trying to hold love together finally discovered that peace was never the opposite of love. Peace was the place where healthy love could finally begin. Whether with someone new, or simply within herself. And the man who once believed distance protected him learned that true strength had never been found in emotional control. It had always been found in emotional presence. Maybe, if there is one truth this entire journey quietly reveals, it is this: the moment she stopped chasing, she did not become harder to love. She simply became impossible to love halfway. She no longer accepted uncertainty disguised as intimacy. She no longer confused waiting with devotion. She no longer believed that proving her worth would finally make someone feel ready. Instead, she chose the quieter path. The one without guarantees. The one where healing happened before answers. The one where peace became more valuable than being chosen. And in doing so, she unknowingly gave him something she had never intended to give. Not another chance. Not another lesson. But a mirror. A mirror that reflected the life he had been living. The love he had been offering. The fears he had been protecting. And eventually, the man he still had time to become. In the end, her peace was never designed to bring him back. It was designed to bring her home. Everything else, including the life he would eventually build from the lessons she left behind, was simply what became possible once two hearts stopped asking love to survive without truth. Because real love does not flourish where one person is endlessly pursuing while the other is endlessly retreating. Real love grows where two people walk toward each other with open hands, steady hearts, and the quiet courage to remain present. And perhaps that is the most hopeful truth of all. The story was never really about losing each other. It was about both of them finally finding themselves. Only then could love, wherever it appeared next, be received not as something to chase, but as something they were finally ready to keep.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.